right, we'll see if it's recording. All right, looks like it's recording. Okay. If you see me going out of screen, Karen, you tell me, okay?
All right, yeah, you're right there.
All right, you gotta stand in the sweet spot.
Right there.
Okay, well, welcome.
I need to put a mark on the floor.
You
like
do,
they
you gotta do
outside.
like a theater mark, right?
That's right.
Like back when I used to do theater. Okay, so welcome. Thanks so much for coming, folks. And probably you know who I am, but I see a few people I haven't met, I think, so I'm going to give a quick thumbnail sketch of me and my role. My name is Whitney Kurtz Ogilvie, and I am the lecturer and academic writing specialist for the graduate writing program at the College of Nursing and also for the UK Healthcare Nurses. And this is the first of what I hope will be a long series of faculty development workshops to help you guys, help your students to produce better writing and better critical thinking, which you guys know is my personal crusade. So, what we're going to talk about today is giving constructive feedback and also efficient feedback, because I know that you guys know what I'm talking about when I say that commenting on student writing is incredibly time consuming. So one of the goals for today is to shave the amount of time that it takes you to comment constructively on student writing. As a matter of fact, some of us really have found that we can't do it. We just can't do it. And some people have resorted to just kind of grading papers and sending them back because they feel like they have so many students and so little time. So we're going to hopefully teach you some strategies so that despite big classes and limited time, we can still give our students some constructive writing comments. I tend to talk fast, so please slow me down if you need to, and if you want to stop me at any point and ask questions, please do. We've got plenty of time, I hope, today to get all this done. So if I'm blazing through, just stop me. Okay, so let's start by talking a little bit about the faculty role in regard to writing. One of the questions that I hear sometimes, or I guess one of the comments that I hear people make is, you know, look, I'm not a writing teacher. I don't want to turn my nursing class into a writing class, and those are absolutely true statements. You're not writing teachers, and you do not and should not want to turn your class into a writing class. So what is our role as nursing faculty when it comes to student writing? As I see it, it's to help ensure consistent writing expectations across the program, meaning when you're grading papers, you should sort of be thinking about the next faculty member that's going to have those students. And the idea that we want students to be building their writing and reasoning skills as they go through the program, as we're all sort of a team. And it's important to ensure that we sort of expect consistency from our students, that there's consistency from professor to professor. We also want to just encourage them to remain or become familiar with foundational writing concepts, like that you have to have a purpose statement, that you have to move logically from idea to idea, that you need an introduction and a conclusion, and kind of what those are supposed to do. Very basic foundational stuff like that. And also to know what resources are available, not only for the students, like me, obviously, the Writing Center, Presentation U, my Blackboard Writing Resources website, but also what resources are available for you. Again, me and Kelt and Presentation U are available at UK to help us. So true, we're not teaching writing. Absolutely we're not. But we do need to comment constructively on it so that as our students move through the program and move from professor to professor, they are receiving consistent messages about what scholarly writing is, what a submission-ready paper is, all of that kind of stuff. So, let's talk a little bit about why good feedback is so important for students. Constructive feedback, number one, it helps students to become familiar with their own strengths and weaknesses, challenges, whatever you want to call them, as writers. And over time, this helps them to self-evaluate, which is a skill that I think we want to teach across the board in graduate school. We want to teach people how to evaluate themselves and not be so dependent on, you know, external validation. And over time, constructive feedback, when it's done well, it helps them to do that. They learn to look for the things that you have pointed out. It also encourages revision, which you guys all know is hugely important. I mean, anybody who's published knows how important revision is. It's a skill that a lot of our students don't have. It's something a lot of our students don't do. They don't have a writing process. It's just panicky, pounding out that first draft the night before it's due, and then never thinking about it again until it's time for the, to put it in the portfolio or the capstone. It also motivates. Constructive feedback gets students jazzed about working on their paper. It's sort of enough of a balance of praise and encouragement and constructive criticism that they actually see a plan to success and they actually see a path, and it gets them excited and motivated. And possibly most importantly, it facilitates critical thinking, which is something that this is a skill that students, especially doctoral students, really need and often really don't have in any kind of well-developed way. So for all those reasons, constructive feedback is crucial. So let's have a little group discussion for a second about what you think some of the characteristics of constructive feedback are. So just take a few minutes to think about that, talk about that, and we can kind of make a list. So when I say constructive feedback, what pops into your head?
Question.
Mm-hmm.
Asking questions.
And Melanie said questions, asking questions. Absolutely.
Keeping it balanced and start with positives.
Keeping it balanced and starting with positives. I'm repeating like a crazy person because I'm guessing that the microphone isn't going to be able to catch everything, so that's why I'm doing that. So asking questions, keeping it positive, keeping it balanced. Absolutely, I agree with all of that so far. What else, if anything?
Consistent.
Consistent.
From paper to paper.
Yeah, absolutely. Consistency from paper to paper. You don't want to nail them for one thing in one paper and then say the completely opposite thing in the next paper. That just creates all kinds of confusion and rage among students, understandably.
About the work, not about the person.
About the work, not about the person. Yeah, oh, that's a huge one. Because I don't know if you guys have noticed this, but writing is incredibly emotional for people. And this is why, as the writing specialist, I keep a box of Kleenex on my desk, because people cry in my office. I mean, it's incredibly personal and incredibly emotional and scary and intimidating. And so I think it is very important to keep a kind of level professional tone, which can be hard to do when you're grading and you're on your 20th paper and you're seeing the same mistake come up for the 8 quadrillionth time, especially when it's from the same student and you've talked to them about it before and you just, oh yeah. So it can be very difficult to do, but it's really important for sure. Anything else?
Avoiding rewriting.
Avoiding rewrite?
Don't just do it. Rewrite it for them.
Oh yeah, I see what you're saying.
Sometimes I want to give some examples, maybe once, but then.
Absolutely. I didn't get what you were saying at first. Yeah, so what Melanie's saying is that you want to avoid basically doing the student's work for them, rewriting the paper for them, which for some of us can be really tough because a lot of us have served as editors and you get that editor vibe going and it's so easy to just go in and fix it, but not a great idea. It really doesn't teach them anything when we do that, and we're going to touch on all of these things in much more detail as we go, but I kind of just wanted to start by getting a sense of where you guys are and where you stand when it comes to constructive feedback. Anything else you want to add before we move on? Those are all great points. So Pat, who just came in, we are having a quick little reflection on what we feel the characteristics of constructive feedback are. So I don't know if you have anything to add, but anybody have anything to add?
So my approach has always been the sandwich.
The sandwich.
Something nice and hit it hard with the crucial conversation and close with something they did well.
Yeah, actually when I was making this presentation, I came across a cute little comic of the feedback sandwich. For some reason, I couldn't get it to transfer into the slides. But yeah, there's a lot of writing teachers who talk about the feedback sandwich, which is what Pat just said. Just that you start with praise, that's the first slice of bread, and then you bring home with the constructive negative criticism, and that's the meat, and then we have another slice of bread on top, and that's more praise, or I guess you could call it encouragement, or pointing out the strengths as well as the weaknesses, right? Well, those are all terrific comments. It sounds like you guys already have some really good instincts when it comes to constructive feedback. So let's talk now a little bit about some of the barriers to effective feedback. And then we're going to talk about some proactive strategies where you can front load some effort in the beginning and end up with better papers to start with. And then we're going to talk about some really great practical strategies for improving your feedback and also hopefully shaving the amount of time that it takes to do it. So that's the order in which we're going to cover all this stuff today. All right, so I found this little comic. I think it's kind of funny. This guy says, rubrics. I never give my students rubrics. That's equivalent to cheating. I might as well write their essays for them. College students should understand that they're expected to perform certain undisclosed outcomes. The point of learning is to keep them guessing about the criteria, so they'll work harder in their desperation not to fail. Stress facilitates success. And then he says, besides, if I gave them a rubric, I'd have to admit that I decide their grades with a dartboard. So I thought that was just obviously the exact opposite of the approach that we want. All right, so what are some barriers to constructive feedback? Well, these are just a few. I'm sure you can come up with some others as well. One potential barrier is a lack of standard criteria across the program. So if we aren't sure in our own minds what the criteria are, and I'm not saying we have this problem here, I'm saying in general, in the world, this tends to be a barrier. So when faculty don't understand or students don't understand what the criteria for a submittable paper are, then that can cause problems, obviously. Large classes, obviously, huge barrier, because if you have 30 students and you only have 2 weeks to do feedback, and I can personally attest that that is really difficult. It's really difficult to give substantive feedback when you have huge classes, and also long papers, which in the doctoral program in particular, we tend to have long papers. I've got to review a 30-page one later today. Fun for me. So I get that, absolutely. Time constraints, obviously, which also connects back to the large classes and long papers. You've got multiple papers due in a semester in one class, very little time for revision, and so when there's no time for revision, sometimes we can think, well, what's the point of giving feedback, because they're not going to turn in multiple drafts, so why should I give them feedback, because they're probably never going to work on this paper again, right? It's very hard to balance efficiency with effectiveness when it comes to giving feedback. And so what often happens is either we scrap the idea entirely and we just kind of look at the rubric and give a grade, or we do very minimal feedback. And these are all very real barriers. I'm not saying they're not. Some other barriers, just exhaustion. It's time consuming. It's personally, emotionally draining, because you're seeing the same mistakes come up again and again and again. And believe me, I know wherever I speak as a writing teacher, when I taught undergraduates, I would have almost 100 students a semester, and they were all writing classes, okay? So in a writing class, you have no option not to give substantive feedback, because that's the whole point of the class. So I would have 96 or 97 students, and they'd have to have a paper due every few weeks. Wowzers. And I would literally, my husband can attest to this, I would literally just lay on the floor and cry. That's how exhausted and frustrated I was at how difficult it was. So I don't want to for a second suggest that I don't get how hard and exhausting this is. Another possible barrier is just not really knowing what the best practices are. Hopefully we're going to solve that problem today if it exists. With you guys, and lack of student engagement or perception that students are not engaged. If we perceive that our students don't read our feedback or that they don't apply our feedback, then that takes the motivation factor way down, because what's the point? Why are you wasting your valuable time that you'll never get back? So hopefully some of the strategies that we talk about later are going to address some of these barriers. So from that sort of sad, sour note to a more hopeful note, let's talk a little bit about some proactive tips to hopefully get better papers from the start, from the get-go, as I say. So one thing that surprises a lot of people is the idea that good feedback can start long before the students even sit down to write their papers. And this is a new idea for a lot of us, that there are proactive strategies to actually get better papers coming in the first place. But it's true, and it absolutely works. First step is strong, clear assignment prompts, and also strong assignments that facilitate those critical thinking skills that we want to develop. So part of the equation is just writing really good assignments and making sure that those prompts are very clear, that expectations are clear. Another way to front load effort is to give students opportunities in class to practice the sort of critical thinking, scholarly reasoning skills that you want to see in their papers. And I believe in making that very much overt in class. So when you've got a class discussion going on and you're seeing them do what you want to see them do in their papers, and this happens a lot where people are better able to do this in in-person discussion type situation than they are when they sit down by themselves to write a paper. I don't know why that is. I'm sure there's probably research on that out there. But it definitely is true. And so when you see it going on, point it out. You know, tell them, all right, what we're doing right now, this is what I mean when I say analyze. Or this is what I mean when I say synthesize. How you guys are talking about all these different things that we've read and how they relate to each other. So in class we can do more of that and make that an overt thing where you explain to them. I think it was you actually, Karen, who said that you had a student come up to you and say, you're always telling me to analyze, so I figured I'd better look up what that word meant, right? And you're just going, oh, okay. So yeah, so some of our students don't know what you mean when you say analyze. They don't know what you mean when they say synthesize. They don't have those skills yet. So do it in class and model it. Obviously, clear expectations and clear criteria are hugely important before you even, set them loose to go and write their papers. So you want to take some time in class to go over your assignment prompt, to take questions, and also, and a lot of us, we teach the same classes every year, and so you get a new crop of those same papers, every fall. So you can anticipate what some of the possible problems are going to be. So address that. When you're talking about the assignment prompt in class, why not take a minute to say, all right, so this is the concept analysis assignment, and in the past, here are some common mistakes or common problems that I've seen with this paper. Deborah Anderson, who I wish so much was here right now because she could tell us about this in more detail, but she teaches 924, the theory course, every fall. And she actually has me come in and do exactly this, where she and we go over the first paper. Actually, I think we do it with the second paper too. And we talk to the students, we take questions, and then I, as the writing specialist who gets a ton of these papers every fall, I tell them, here's what problems we tend to see. And so you're just preventing the fire before it starts. And believe me, Deborah will tell you, it shows in the final product. It absolutely does. Simplest thing in the world to do, great results. So the other thing that I would recommend is we've all got pet peeves when it comes to writing. Some of us just can't stand it when people forget to put a period after the all and et al. Some of us can't stand it when people forget that data is plural. I mean, we all have pet peeves, right? Is that yours? Yeah, that drives me crazy too. And they're not all grammar pet peeves. Some people have a lot of problems with people not supporting their ideas enough or not including a clear purpose statement or whatever. So whatever your particular pet peeves are, tell them beforehand that this semester I'm going to be looking for this, this, and this. These are particular pet peeves of mine, so don't do it, right? We've all got them, so share them, why not? So we all know intellectually that revision is really important. Certainly if you have published anything and you're a writer yourself, you know how important revision is. And when I say revision, I'm not talking about proofreading the paper. There's a big diff, in my opinion, between editing, which I would call fixing surface stuff, moving commas around, fixing grammar, doing a spell check, that's editing. When I say revision, what I mean is a substantive reworking of the ideas, developing your ideas more, looking at the structure of the paper, the organization, and whether it flows logically from one idea to another. So the deep sort of invention level stuff is what I mean when I say revision. And it's really important, and not just for writing skills, but for thinking skills, because our ideas develop and they deepen and they change as we go through multiple drafts of a paper. So, and I know you're all gonna hear this and be like, yeah, not realistic, but I'm just begging you, if at all possible, at the doctoral level especially, please, if at all possible, try to build opportunities for this into your syllabus. I know it's hard, I really do. But if there's any way to allow multiple drafts, and I'm not saying you got to comment on all of them. That's where peer review comes in, and there are definitely ways. Like I know Carolyn, who just came in, you do like an outline assignment, and that's one way you can do this, to have them at least give you an outline where they explain to you what their main ideas are, what order they're going to come in, and that at least is some form of writing process, where it's not just pounding out that first draft the night before it's due and turning it in and that's it. So some method of allowing those ideas to develop and deepen is so important. So if it's at all possible, try to build that into your class structure. And if it's not possible in class, then we at least need to be reinforcing it in advising. because now in the DMP program we switched over to the portfolio, where basically any course paper is fair game for the portfolio. So as advisors, we need to be checking in with students now and again and making sure, what papers are you thinking of for this exemplar in the portfolio, and how'd you do on it? What changes you think you might make? Just as part of your advising meetings. I'm not saying every time, but just kind of check in, or have them come to me and I'll check in with them. But revision is so, so, so important, and I really feel strongly that if we're sending our doctoral students out into the world without having learned that, then we're doing them a disservice, because it's just such a crucial step. Another thing, and this also can be controversial, so I'm going controversy 1 and controversy 2 here, but I strongly recommend discussing sample papers in class, exemplars of the paper that you're assigning. Most of us, as I say, we teach the same classes every year, so if you have a paper that you think is a great example, just ask that student, would you mind if I use this next year as an example? And I've never had one say no. So just ask, and if they say yes, great. This is a best practice across the country. Writing centers and faculty development specialists all over the country recommend doing this. This is not just Whitney's crusade. This is a best practice for writing instruction. And it's supported by a metric ton of research in composition and rhetoric. So not just my own pet project, it really, really is a really good idea. Some faculty are resistant to this idea, and I understand why. It's because they think they're going to get 20 copies of the sample. And that is a totally valid concern. And in fact, I share that concern myself. But I think it's a concern that can be overcome just by dialogue with the students, and also by giving more than one exemplar. Most of the time when we assign a paper, not every student approaches it in the same way, and we can pick, maybe 2 or 3 papers that have slightly different approaches to the assignment that are all really good. And so that's one way to fix it. And then the other way to fix it is just to make sure that the students understand that, look, I'm not presenting these as perfect specimens. I'm just presenting them as a few examples of what previous students have done with this assignment. They're strong examples, they're not perfect. You can talk in class about the strengths and weaknesses, or on the discussion board online about the strengths and weaknesses of the paper. But just to talk to them a little bit, that this isn't the only approach, and please don't turn in a paper that's using this one as a template. That's not what this is for. I think if you just have that discussion, that you can overcome a lot of that concern about getting 20 kind of identical papers. If you don't want to do that, if you don't want to give them full papers, then another way that you can use this best practice is just to do it piecemeal. So if you don't want to give them a whole sample paper, then maybe give them a sample introduction or a sample conclusion. Or my personal favorite, pick excerpts that demonstrate specific skills that you want to see more of in their papers. For us in the doctoral program, it's mostly analysis and synthesis of ideas. These are the skills that involve the heavy-duty critical thinking, and this is where our students tend to struggle. So just pick excerpts that show those skills. And then you don't have to give them a whole paper, and you don't have to worry that they're going to copy it, but still you've given them sort of something to grab onto. Some of these assignments that we ask of our students are just tricky for them, and they need to kind of get their heads around what you're looking for. So exemplars can be good for that. And a pro tip for online learning, which a lot of us use obviously, is to consider marking up your sample papers. I do this in my summer course where we learn to write a literature review. So what I mean by marking up is save the sample as a PDF, and Adobe has this neat little feature where you can go in and put sticky notes that are kind of like the comment bubbles in Word. So you can go in and you can find like a passage from the sample paper that you feel like really demonstrates what you mean when you say synthesize or analyze, or to talk about implications, or what you mean when you say to integrate your quotes smoothly into the paper. And you can just kind of quickly annotate. And I'm going to show you an example from a paper that I assign in my summer class where we write a lit review. And this is a published lit review. And you can see I've highlighted this section, and then I wrote here a nice example of synthesis. Note that the authors begin by opening a discussion of one of the themes they identified, control. They then do a lovely job of drawing out details relating to this concept from a number of studies and showing how these studies relate to each other. This study said this, while this study said that. They don't do an exhaustive summary of each individual study. They're pulling out the relevant information with a bird's eye view of their review as a whole. So that's just one example, and I annotated a few other passages in this lit review as well. And seriously, it took me like 10 minutes or less to do it. It was super fast, and I got so much good feedback about this from my students from that class. They loved it that I did this for them, because we had just talked about synthesis in class, and then they went home to read this, and it just reinforced it, so that they got a real life example there in their reading for homework of what we were talking about in class, and it just kind of keeps continuity. And personally, I think it works great. So it's just one more little trick, front loading, another strategy that you can front load to make sure your students are understanding what you're asking of them. Some more proactive tips. Teach students to turn their assignment prompts into checklists. This does a lot to prevent students missing assignment requirements. A lot of us, myself included, do our assignment prompts as blocks of text. And it's really easy to miss something in a block of text. It just is. It happens all the time. Especially if you're using little 3-letter words like why or how. I mean, that's like a tiny little 3-letter word, and your eyes can so easily skip over that and miss it. And then because you didn't see the why, then you didn't go deeper with that idea. And then there's no analysis in there. So if you turn your assignment prompt into a checklist, you put every separate requirement on a separate line, and you can just go through and check off to make sure you've met every assignment requirement, and then you can have them turn it in with the paper as kind of a signed contract to you that, yes, I have fulfilled every requirement of this paper. And then if they didn't, you can say, no, you didn't. But more often than not, it helps. And this is another thing that Deborah Anderson does with her 924. And in her case, I just made it for her because I was working with so many of her students on that paper, and so many of them were leaving out the same requirements for some reason, that I just made this little checklist and sent it to her and said, why don't you start giving this to your students? And then the next semester, we saw way fewer omissions like that. So super easy little strategy. Another thing you can do is, I'm going to call out Dr. Williams back here, because this is what you started doing, right? Where you tell your students that you're going to send back ungraded any paper that does not reach a certain level on the rubric. Did I get that right? Sort of, kind of? Okay, I'm sorry, I'm putting you on the spot while you're eating.
Well, usually it has to be pretty bad. But I do find cases of that. So sometimes I just simply say this, this is just, take the rubric and look at it.
Right.
And review the paper.
Right.
And I'll have a conference with them, usually phone conference.
Right.
Yes, but I don't, usually it's more than one rubric.
Right.
I mean, well, it's more than one part of the rubric. Usually it's really I think almost anybody in this room would say it needs to be redone.
Right, right. So if they don't reach a certain level of proficiency,
I mean, that's the ideal situation.
Right. I think it's a great idea. I really do, because it gives them, it helps them understand that they're responsible for their own work, and I think all those are good strategies. I'm going to show you a sample checklist. This is the one that I made for Dr. Anderson's 924 for the concept analysis, which is the first paper in the class, and these are brand new D&P students. They take it in the fall, and so they're brand new at this, and this for them especially, I'm not necessarily saying you have to do this to students who've been in the program for 3 years, but for the first semester, I think this is really helpful for them to have. And you see how everything is on a separate line. Even here where it says summarize uses of the concept in general, in the health belief model, in advanced nursing practice, in your specialty. What I was finding when I was looking at these papers is that inevitably they'd leave out 1 or 2 of those. And so if you put everything on a separate line, then it encourages them to not forget. Okay. So those are proactive strategies that you can use before the students even write the paper to hopefully ensure a better product, which obviously saves you time on commenting, right? So that's the first time saving tip, is to be proactive. So now let's get into the nitty-gritty in terms of tips for constructive and efficient feedback. So what do we do? What don't we do? All right, so first a little background. When you're commenting, there are kind of 2 categories of things to worry about. We have global concerns and we have local concerns. Global concerns deal with content and ideas. It's what we write. Local concerns have to do with error correction, and it's how we write. Okay, we've got what we write and how we write, 2 categories. So some examples of global content-related critique. Does the paper meet the assignment requirements? Does it have a strong, clear purpose statement? Does the paper fulfill that purpose? Are the main points fully developed? Are they adequately supported? Are ideas logically organized, right? All that is sort of deep stuff. And then local concerns, where are there mistakes in grammar, mechanics, APA, or whatever style is required? Where are there formatting problems? Where are there typos? Where are there problems with tone or scholarly voice or word choice? I could think of 8 million more, but you get the idea that these are the 2 categories. And ideally, you want to balance them. What we oftentimes get is just a lot of this and very little of this. So a lot of local error correction type stuff and very little of the substantive, critiques that get to the actual thinking process. And I also want to teach you about the 3 different types of written feedback. So we have editorial feedback, which goes back to the local concerns that we just talked about. So this is where we label grammatical errors, we cross stuff out, we change the order of the wording of a sentence. There's no comment on the changes with editorial feedback. It's just kind of going through and like I said, editing. Directive feedback is declarative statements where you tell the students what to do or what not to do. So avoid this, avoid using informal language in a scholarly paper, avoid starting a sentence with blank, avoid X, Y, or Z. Facilitative feedback is the last kind, and this is a type of feedback that facilitates critical thinking, encourages students to engage more deeply with their ideas. Okay? So we've got editorial, directive, and facilitative. So you want to strive, as I say, for a good balance among these 3 types of feedback, and a good balance among global and local concerns as well. But at the doctoral level, I feel like we should aim for a bit more emphasis on the facilitative feedback, and very little on the editorial, especially, where we're going through and editing, like Melanie said, you don't want to do the work for the student.
Yeah, I can't really get to the local if I just can't deal with the global.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
The other way sometimes works though too. I mean, sometimes it's so bad you can't figure out what they're trying to say.
Oh, absolutely. We've all seen those kinds of papers too, where it really is, the grammar and the sentence structure is so bad that you have no idea what they're trying to say. And that's a special case, and we're going to get to that.
But it happens.
It absolutely happens. Absolutely it does. I was surprised at how often it happens when I started working with graduate students. I thought that was going to be long gone, and it was not long gone. Carolyn, did you have a question?
Are you going to make these slides available?
Absolutely, yes. This is
Okay.
going to come to everybody. And there's videotaping as well. So, yes, you will all get the slides. Please don't panic about taking notes frantically or any of that. All right. So, biggest time-saving tip I can give you is don't line edit your students' work. And this is a sea change for some of us, because this is very common for people to do this, to just go through and flip, fix everything, point out every error. It's something I struggle with because, like I said, I've worked as an editor. It's really hard to turn that off because it's so easy to go in and fix it. But John Bean is a particular guru of mine. He is an expert in writing across the curriculum, which is what you guys in the undergraduate program are starting to do. You got to read this guy's stuff. He is a genius. And he's just a genius writing teacher and theorist as well. And in his book, Engaging Ideas, which is aimed at faculty, he points out that not only do students not learn when all their grammatical and mechanical errors are pointed out to them, because then they just learn to lean on you. And you're going to point them out every time, and we're good. I'm going to let the teacher fix it for me, right? Even if you don't fix them for them, if you point out every error for them, they're not learning to do that for themselves, okay? But he also points out that students will often self-correct those sentence-level problems during revision anyway. And so if you're seeing a paper with a lot of sentence-level errors, chances are they didn't proofread it carefully. And that's the only problem, is that they did not proofread it carefully. He found 75% of students could do this with little to no guidance. Just, they were made to proofread and they fixed almost everything. Yeah.
You know, I always tell the students to sit in a room and read it out loud. And,
Absolutely.
you know, I think that would help.
It absolutely helps. What Carolyn said for you video folks is she encourages her students to read her work out loud. And that is a particular crusade of mine as well, so try to get all the students reading their stuff aloud. Back when I used to teach undergrads in composition courses, I would do this peer review session for every big paper. We'd have one first draft and then the final draft, and for the first draft we'd do a group workshop. And I would have them read their papers to each other. And I would walk around the room, and all over the room I'd hear people saying, oh, why did I think that sentence made sense? Oh, no, that doesn't work. You'd hear people self-correcting as they went. All it takes is hearing it. But a lot of people, and in fact, I'd say, I don't know, this is very off the top of my head, but a hefty percentage of my students, when I ask them, do you read your work out loud, they say no. And so it's a skill they don't necessarily know to use, but absolutely yes. This change alone of not line editing is the biggest time saver that you could possibly have. Don't feel like you have to point out every error, and certainly don't fix them for them. You had a question, yes?
So I was going to say, with the technology that we have, one thing that's been very helpful to me and that I've recommended to others is to actually have the computer read whatever they've typed into the computer. Because even again, sometimes you're skipping over things, you're not seeing those errors, and you might think it's there in the sentence, even when you read it out loud sometimes.
Do you mean having the computer read it out loud, like a voice?
Yes, the computer voice. I do that like on my iPad when I'm right before, like in my final draft. I have it read it to me, and I catch a lot of it.
I didn't know you could do that either, but that's awesome. Does it read it in like a Stephen Hawking voice, or is it like?
No, well, it depends. There's like on my iPad, I have an app that's called Allow, and it is a little bit computerized, but at the same time, you can change the speed, you can change the sound of the voice so that it's more comfortable for you, and so you're not, you're not thinking something is in there that's not there, and just reading through that mistake.
Well, I like that idea. So there's an app called Aloud then on iPad that can read your work to you, and also the low-tech way to do that would just be get a friend to do it for you.
Yeah.
Get somebody to read it to you. I would say follow along with a printed copy. But yeah, if you don't want to do it yourself, or if you experiment and you find that that's more helpful to you, which may be for some students, then absolutely. But this is going to save you chunks of time you will not believe. Just not do that. So instead of line editing, what do we do instead, okay? What you want to do is identify patterns of weakness, so recurring errors, things that pop up again and again and again. Because when people have a lot of inconsistent mistakes, they're not proofreading that. More often than not, and I'm sure there are exceptions, because I'm seeing people looking at me skeptically, but more often than not, when you have inconsistency in mistakes, then careful proofreading will help a great deal with that. When there are recurring mistakes, somebody just does not know how to use a semicolon, they've got a lot of run-on sentences, whatever, then that is a pattern of weakness that you can point out to the student, okay? And then what you want to do is give a few examples of that from the paper, okay? And then if you want to, you can demonstrate how to fix it, or if you want to, you can just point them to a link online. This is what I usually do, is put a little link in my comment to my blog or something online that shows them how to use a semicolon, and then they go do it. And again, that facilitates that autonomy that we want to see in our students, and it really helps them, I think, a lot more than just fixing it for them. As Carolyn said, encourage reading aloud, because it is the easiest way to improve your sentence level writing, hands down. I used to tell my undergrads, it's the easiest way to turn a B into an A, C into a B, is just to start reading your stuff out loud. So here's some sample feedback about grammar and mechanics. First one, Sarah, overall your writing is smooth and clear. However, I noticed a number of problems with subject-verb agreement and quite a few misused semicolons. And then I would give specific examples of each of these from the paper, or sometimes I like to just highlight them in different colors, like blue for semicolons and green for subject-verb agreement, and then they go back and color code it that way. Here are two great links to check out. Subject-verb agreement, link. Semicolon usage, link. And then, here's the really important part, in the next draft, or in the next paper, if you're not allowing multiple drafts, I'd like to see these errors corrected. Or in the next paper, I expect fewer of these errors. Or I don't expect to see this again next time. You can also add that if they go to these links and they're still confused, they can always come see me. Or they can go to the Writing Center and have a tutor explain it to them, whatever. But hold them accountable. that I'm giving you the tools to fix this. Now in the next paper, I want to see some improvement on this. So this is a student who has consistent errors with grammar. Here's an example from a student who has inconsistent errors. So it says, Kyle, your paper is thought-provoking and your ideas are logically organized, if only, right? However, grammatical errors and typos are making the paper tough to read. Since you don't have a lot of repeated errors, just a large number of different ones, I have a feeling that careful proofreading would solve this problem. Try reading your work out loud. It will slow you down and make it much easier to catch mistakes. In the next paper, I'd like to see the results of much more careful proofreading. And this gets at something that I think I'm going to touch on a little more detail later, which is that writing, again, is a process, okay? So you don't necessarily expect the same amount of quality, the same level of quality from a first semester, first paper student as you would from a student who's been here for a year and a half and is writing perhaps their 12th paper that they've written since they've been there. So that's something to think about as well. To not expect perfection at the very first paper, but to facilitate that process of building those skills as we go through the program. And that's another reason why it's so important that we all give feedback. Because if you're just handing a paper back with nothing but a grade, then think about the next professor that's going to have that same student, and nobody's been facilitating those skills, and so their level is going to stay the same until somebody intervenes. Okay? Here's some sample feedback about formatting. APA drives us crazy, so we've got to touch on this. Review the 6th edition APA rules for formatting headings and subheadings here. Insert link. Your level 1 headings are spot on, but the level 2 and 3 headings aren't quite right. So again, you're telling them there's a problem, you're not telling them how to fix it, they're going to go find out how to fix it. Okay? It looks like you've entered your page numbers by typing them in at the bottom of each page rather than inserting them in a footer. Right? Why do people do that? This will cause formatting headaches anytime you add or omit text from your paper. Here's a quick guide to inserting page numbers correctly. Insert link. Bada bing, bada boom. They've got the tools to fix it. There we go. Right? All right. So don't fixate on grammar, formatting, or APA style. Don't fixate on it. Unless you've got a student who is just turning in a train wreck, and it's clear, and this will sometimes happen with our second language students, where the grammar problems are greater than the invention stage critical thinking problems. That sometimes happens, and that's a different story, obviously. But try not to fixate on grammar, because what often happens is we will spend so much time on the sentence level stuff that we don't even have time to get to the organization or the ideas. And as a matter of fact, the Walden University Writing Center, they did a survey of their students, and they looked at what the most common student comments on Constructive Feedback were. One of the most common comments that students made, and this was graduate and undergraduate students, was that the professor commented so much on grammar, mechanics, and APA that I have no idea what she thinks about my ideas or my organization. So I know, I know how to fix my surface stuff, but I have no idea how to revise this, except just to proofread it better. And obviously that's a problem, especially at the doctoral level. So ideas and organization are the most important things. And the other reason not to fixate on grammar and formatting is because it approaches feedback as error correction. That it's just error correction. That's all you're doing when you comment, it's just you're fixing mistakes. And the writing process is so much more complicated and so much deeper than that. We don't want to send the message that that's what revision is, that you just go through and you correct your sentence level mistakes. We want to send the message that you let your ideas develop and deepen and become richer over time. So it's a really, really important message to send. So my suggestion is to model your feedback on the principle of Socratic teaching, which is about asking questions, which is just what Melanie said earlier when I asked what's constructive feedback. Give students questions rather than telling them the answers. So what you want to do is you want to nudge them in the right direction by asking them questions and letting them do the thinking to get there. This kind of feedback helps students grow both as thinkers and as writers, which is what we want, right? Like I said at that meeting, the graduate faculty meeting in December, we talk a lot about writing problems, but bad writing is not the disease. Bad writing is a symptom of the disease. The disease is that they don't have highly developed critical thinking and reasoning skills. That's the problem. Writing is just the tip of the iceberg. That's just the part we see. But the problem is much deeper and more serious and has implications way beyond writing. It has implications for leadership. It has implications for evidence-based practice. It has implications everywhere. So what we want to be doing is facilitating those thinking and reasoning skills as much as we can.
Can you give an example?
Yes, absolutely. You mean of Socratic feedback? Yeah. It's coming on the next slide. General example, why and how are good kind of seeds to begin with. Why is this, or why does this work, or or how does this work? Why and how are good places to start. But here are some examples. So what does this have to do? I just took these from some papers that I commented on, actually. What does this have to do with the main focus of your paper, or your leadership philosophy? This is interesting information. Just be sure to connect the dots for us so we understand its relevance. Because a lot of times we see people kind of plunking stuff down, and they see the connection because they live in their own head. But readers, they're not making the connection for readers of how this little factoid or statistic or point that they're making relates to the overall purpose of the paper. And so a very common piece of feedback for me is, how does this relate to your purpose, or how does this relate to the central theme of your paper? Another example, can you give us an example to illustrate this concept, to show us how it might work in practice? Another example might be, what recommendation or recommendations might you make to help hospitals implement and educate nursing staff about your intervention? So just asking for more information. In this paper, as I recall, the student had sort of developed this intervention that she thought would be a good idea to use, and basically made the point that, there might be some barriers to implementation, and the nurses might need some training, but really didn't go into any detail about what that might involve. And so I was asking her to just go a little bit further there and think about, how would you actually implement this? Are there any questions we need to answer before we can move forward? This is a good one. What might future studies on this topic examine? It gets them thinking about what the gaps are in our knowledge. Questions like that are good. Be sure to address the so what question here. Why is this important? Again, a comment about relevance. Why does this matter? Why is this important? I could give you a trillion examples, but the idea is that you're asking questions rather than making declarative statements where you give them the answer. What you want is to nudge them in the direction that you want them to go in by asking questions. And really, it gets at the heart of what I think really good feedback is, which is a dialogue between you and the student, as if you were just sitting there and talking to each other. What questions come up as you're reading this? And when those questions come up, you put them in the paper. You write them in the margin so that the student knows that as a reader, that's what you were wondering as you read that. So more generally, you want to ask questions that make students think about implications. The so what. Now that we have this information, what do we do with it? Where do we go from here? You want to ask questions that help students recognize and clarify their own thinking process. How did you get from A to B here? Can you give us a smoother transition here, because I'm not sure how you got from this to this, right? And that helps them examine kind of their own thinking. What was the segue in their own mind, right? You can ask them questions that challenge their assumptions. And we see a lot of assumptions in our students' writing, a lot of things that they're just sort of taking for granted. And, sometimes those are okay and sometimes they're not. So you can ask questions that challenge those. You can ask questions that get them to think about what the opposition to their position might be. What might other people say about this? Ask questions that help students take their ideas further and deeper. And a good principle to follow is to respond like a reader, not just like a grader. Okay, so again, you want to turn your attention away from error correction and onto invention and the foundational critical thinking processes. So respond like a reader. When you were reading it, what did you think about? What did you wonder about? Don't keep those questions to yourself, share them with the student. Another good idea is to include background in your feedback. So references to class discussions, references to readings, references to an earlier draft of the paper, or to a previous paper that that student wrote in your class. References to the assignment prompt or the rubric, references to a class speaker or a presentation or a conference that you all went to. So sort of take it off the page, and helps them learn synthesis, because what is synthesis but thinking about how different elements relate to each other. So when you bring in all this stuff, and that gets them thinking, you know, in all kinds of different directions, and helps them learn how to synthesize. And another good piece of advice is to pick your battles. We've been talking a lot about, you know, you don't have to point out every mistake. Try to avoid, you know, overloading students and overwhelming students. And one of the most common comments from students in that Walden University survey was, I just got back this paper and it just looked like somebody had slaughtered an animal all over it. It was so red, and I was just completely overwhelmed. And the other impact that can have sometimes is a student who's already insecure about his or her writing will then just feel awful, that I'm just the worst writer in the world. Look at all these mistakes. Oh God, I'm hopeless. And then they're not motivated to fix it. They're just defeated, which is bad, obviously. A student obviously cannot fix a dozen major problems by the next draft. That's just not realistic. So focus on the most important issues while still telling them that there are a lot of errors. So you don't want to pretend that those mistakes aren't there, but you want to say something like, you know, today I'm focusing more on your organization and your use of source material. I'm not really making many comments on grammar or APA, although there are errors. But we're going to save that for a later draft when your content is a little stronger, or whatever. And again, some of this might not be as possible in one class, but in advising, when we're helping our students through the portfolio process, this is where you can really do this kind of stuff. And I do it all the time with my students, where I'll tell them, you know, I'm seeing some grammar issues. They're not a huge problem, so I'm not going to really focus on that as much today, because I know you're going to send me another draft in a week, and that paragraph might be gone in a week. You know, I mean, and that's another thing, is when you're revising, what is the point of exhaustively editing every draft of a paper when there's a chance you're going to be cutting huge chunks of it and adding new stuff, and save that for the end. Don't waste your time and everybody else's. Yeah, Carolyn, a question?
I think one of the concerns we might have in some cases is that there might not be another draft.
Right. Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
In other words, that's it, and then it gets to the advisor in the portfolio, and you kind of worry a little bit about.
Right. Yeah.
I think it's just the reality of
you're absolutely
and
right.
I'm really talking here about the DFP program with some
Yes.
25 to 28 students in a class.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
You can't do very many reruns on it. So
No
the
question.
question becomes, where do they get that?
How do you negotiate that when you can't do multiple rewrites in the same class, right? Yeah, part of that equation, I think, is for us all as a faculty to kind of have consistent expectations about all of this. So what are we expecting within a class, within one semester, and then what are we expecting within advising? Again, that's part of why I'm here. So when they get to that stage of revising it for the portfolio, I can help them. But absolutely, you're right, that not every class, you can't build multiple drafts into every class, and that's absolutely true. So a lot of this, as I said, is going to apply more to advising than it is to an individual paper in an individual class. But even within an individual class, you want to use some of those earlier strategies of pointing out examples and encouraging reading out loud, rather than going through and just correcting all the mistakes for them. Does that help answer your question?
Yeah, well, I guess, a recent situation, I said, they're, if you're going to use this paper for anything else.
Right, absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
You need to pay attention to it.
Well, and I don't know if you were...
You hope the student shares that with the advisor.
Right,
but
right.
you don't know.
Oh, absolutely, you don't.
And we don't send our comments to the advisors with one exception, and that is in the IRB application.
Mm-hmm.
Then we do, the instructor, in my case, I usually am the instructor.
Yeah.
Although Susan worked with this last summer on it, and Susan and I sent Suzanne Frazier, and I sent comments to the advisor as well as to the student, since the advisor has the last go at it with the student.
I would assume though that the student would still have the feedback,
The
right?
student will have the feedback, but the advisor doesn't have the benefit, and you know.
Right, but the advisor can ask for it, you know what I mean? Like the advisor can say, can I
Maybe that's
see?
what the advisor needs to be doing.
Right.
I'm not comfortable sending comments to.
Oh, no, I agree completely. I think that has to lie with the student, but absolutely, when a student comes to me with a paper, and I always ask them, have you gotten feedback on this from your instructor? And if they say yes, I say, can I see it? You know, because it helps me. And if they say no, fine, that's fine. You know, it's just, it always helps me to see the feedback. But I think that this is something that we need to talk about as a faculty and sort of figure out what our strategy is. And that's another reason why back in December I said we need more conversation about all this kind of stuff. But the reality is, as you said, you know, with huge class sizes, we just can't go through and do everything at once. So we have to pick our battles. We have to focus on the most important problems. And also we have to revise our expectations to the extent that I think that we should expect careful proofreading. I think we absolutely should expect that. And I think at the doctoral level, to be honest, that it's perfectly acceptable to say to a student, I can tell you haven't proofread this. Are you kidding me? Go proofread it and give it back to me. Seriously? And to make that expectation clear from the beginning, that if I see a paper and it's full of little mistakes, I'm not grading it until you fix them, because you guys are doctoral students and you need to be turning in a clean draft. And so then at that point, hopefully the papers that you're getting have been clearly proofread, and you can assume that any problems that remain are things that the student is really struggling with, and you can send them to me or to the writing center. But yeah, it's something that we need to have a conversation about as a faculty, I think, for sure. For sure. I was going to say something a minute ago and it flew right out of my head. Maybe it'll come back to me as I'm clicking through this. Okay, and so somebody said earlier, I think it was Kat Burkhart, she said to make sure to include positive feedback. Oh, you said that. Here. Yeah, you said positive feedback. So students need to understand their strengths as well as their weaknesses. So positive feedback is not about warm fuzzies, although that's a nice little side effect. But it's really about the fact that most students can talk at great length about what they're bad at, but most of them cannot tell you what they're good at. And what that means is that when they go to revise, they'll often throw the baby out with the bathwater. They'll throw out the good stuff as well as the bad stuff because they have no idea what's good and what's bad. And so to help them understand what a good paper looks like, you need to point out what's working as well as what's not. Also, praise is motivating. And I had a professor in grad school who was the queen of this. I mean, she was so good at just picking just enough motivating positive things to say that even if she piled a mountain of negative criticism on you afterward, you would still be jazzed about working on the paper. I would say a good 90% of the students that come to my office, and this includes the ones that are quite proficient as writers, will say, I'm a terrible writer. People are very insecure about their writing. And so we need to help them understand what they're good at as well as what they're bad at. It's important. Another tip is to include a brief summary at the end of the paper that mentions its strengths, identifies areas for improvement, and most important, suggests a clear action plan for the next draft or the next paper. What do you expect from them next time? When I gave that sample feedback earlier, I added that little line at the end that, you know, in the next paper I expect to see that these errors are corrected. Or in the next paper I expect to see more careful proofreading or whatever. So clear action plan. And this comments on the paper as a whole. Kind of generally, you know, is the message coming across? Is it clear? Are you getting what you think they want you to get out of it? Holistic feedback. And this, of course, is in addition to the specific margin comments as you go, which are very important as well, obviously. Turnitin, the anti-plagiarism software company, they do research studies quite a bit, and they did one last year that surveyed both students and faculty. Actually, the majority of the respondents were graduate students, interestingly enough. And I think it was something like 78% of students surveyed said that those margin comments were the most helpful to them. The ones just throughout the paper that were anchored to specific things throughout. But they also agreed that the little thing at the end is important too, because it combines that kind of proximate feedback that's anchored to the specific things in the paper with holistic feedback, and just a nice balance.
think it's really important for students to have an understanding of, okay, at the end, the summary comments, okay, you're gonna grade the paper according to a rubric and
Right.
the learning objectives for the assignment. But then, especially if it's a paper that they might use for the portfolio
Right.
or other doctoral project, they need to have an idea. Before this is submitted for publication,
Absolutely.
you need significant revision and back with me. But for purposes of this course, here's your grade.
Thank you so much for saying
You
that,
need to have
because
some idea.
you just reminded me what I was going to say a minute ago, so bless you for that. It touches on just what Melanie was just saying, which is that they need to know that, you know, here's your grade for this class, for this paper, based on the 2 weeks you had to write it and the fact that we couldn't factor in any revision time. But if you're going to do anything with this, if you're going to use it for your portfolio, it needs significant revisions here, here, and here. And that goes back to something that I touched on real briefly at that graduate faculty meeting in December, which is the idea of ghost grades, which some writing programs across the country have started doing. Basically what that is you give them the grade that they're getting on the paper that's based on time constraints and the fact that you couldn't build in a draft and all this kind of stuff. And that's the grade that they're getting that goes in the grade book, and that's much more lenient. But you also give them a ghost grade or a shadow grade that is as if you were reading as a completely dispassionate journal editor or committee member or whatever, that really sort of tells it like it is, and that grade doesn't count. It's just there to let them know kind of where it is in terms of if they were going to try to publish it, if they were going to try to put it in their portfolio. And even if you don't like the idea of 2 separate grades, still what Melanie was saying about making sure they understand that if you're going to do anything else with this, it needs heavy revision, I think is very important. Yes, Dan?
Yeah, as an editor of the journal, I get some of those papers sometimes where this hasn't been
Right.
taught. So I wish I could clone her to tell everybody to tell their students that.
Right.
Because there is a difference between.
Yes, there totally is. And people will probably think, well, I got an A on it, so surely it's publication ready. You know, students need to understand that's not the case at all. And that's one thing that those little shadow grades do, is send that message. The other thing I think I'd really love to see us do as a faculty, and I'm going to bring this up again when we have the whole faculty together, is to do what I have found some other programs doing, which is put our heads together and actually come up with a simple little form or checklist, like 10 steps to a submission-ready paper, or something like that, where they have a simple little thing that's in everybody's syllabus. I mean, I know we have a rubric, but something that's just super, like, bullet-pointed, super easy to read might help. So something I think I want to talk about as a faculty later on. All right.
Talk to Deborah Mosier about that.
Deborah Mosier would be a great person to talk to.
A tool very similar to that.
Great. Yeah, she's such a smart writer and she has a good eye as well for reading student writing. All right, so another little tip, be sure to proofread your feedback because students can justify disregarding it if it's full of errors itself. And you can actually run a spell check and grammar check on your comment bubbles. It takes 2 seconds. So just be careful. It's all right if one slips in every now and again, but believe me, they'll take any excuse to ignore you and disregard you because it's hard to revise our writing. You also want to, if you can, avoid shorthand and abbreviations like awk for awkward wording, because they might not know what that is. Now, if you give them a key in the syllabus, then go ahead. But if you're just sticking that in there and hoping they'll understand it, chances are they won't. And that, in fact, was one of the other most common student complaints was, I don't know what this abbreviation means. And we talked about being realistic about expectations and about how these skills have to build. So it makes sense to have different expectations for different points in the program, and I think we just all need to be aware of that. All right, a couple more quick little time-saving tips. This has saved my life, and I only recently found out about this, but you can use autocorrect to save time with your most frequently used comments. And I will show you how to do it. If you want me to come to your office to show you how to do it, it's super easy. But you can set autocorrect to enter a block of text when you enter a little abbreviation. So one of mine is et al. And when I type et al in a comment bubble, it says always put a period after the all in et al. Or when I type cit, it says cite your source or sources. When I type sem, it gives them the link to my blog post on semicolon usage. It is awesome because, I mean, rather than having to type out the same thing on 20 papers, Oh man, is it great. I'll come to your office to show you how to do it if you want. But use it, it's great.
I think people are gathering out there.
Oh really?
Oh,
Well,
their
we
class.
technically have the room until 1, but yeah, we'll wrap up in just a sec. So another little tip is to try using different colors to highlight different problems, and then you don't have to comment on each instance if you just give them a legend that like blue is ideas that need more support, and green is, you know, something that's confusingly worded or whatever. And obviously give them a little legend, but that can be a good time-saving tip as well. You also might want to consider alternatives to written feedback, like audio or video. If you just get so sick of typing, you can record feedback to students. Conferences are good, in person or Skype. All helpful. So I was going to do a little thing on peer feedback. I think just because of the great participation, we're sort of running out of time. But I am going to send this PowerPoint to you. So I'm going to quickly skip past peer feedback just now and talk a little bit about something that I think is really important, and this is just a quick couple of slides. But I think that a lot of the tips that I am sharing with you are not going to work until we get our students involved in their feedback. So what that means is, it's sometimes a good idea to discuss effective feedback as a class and sort of get what their complaints and expectations are. Make sure they know how to ask you questions, like whether you prefer email or face-to-face or a visit or whatever. And most importantly, consider having them respond to their feedback. And this does not have to be a big deal. This can be simple as a little worksheet that I can make for you or help you make that's called revision plan. And this is especially good for papers that you know they're likely to use in their portfolio. It's also something you can do as an advisor. And you can require students to apply feedback to the next paper or the next draft, or you can reward them when they do. But I think it's definitely important to hold them accountable when the same problems are coming up again and again and again. And make sure that they know that they're going to be held accountable for that. Okay? All right, so I'm sorry that we went so much to the wire, but I am so glad that you guys participated as much as you did. And I'm going to send you this PowerPoint. And I just thank you so much for coming. You guys had great questions, and hopefully this will be helpful.
This was very helpful, very helpful.
Great. I'm going to do another one in the fall on facilitating better critical thinking, so I hope you'll come to that one too.
Thanks so much. We're rushing to another meeting.
I know, I have to go too. Thanks. What room is that in, by the way, guys? 315. 315, okay. Thanks so much, folks.